This panel is called Disentangling Development, Politics, Environment, and Social Change in Himachal Pradesh. Now, as you'll notice, other panels are regional in orientation. This one is more specific. This relates to one particular state. And certainly we could have, and I did think of perhaps enlarging this a bit also into Western Himalayas perhaps. And that would have included experiences of Uttarakhand and Jammu and Kashmir at the very least. But there's a very good reason why we want to focus on Himachal Pradesh. It is or one state in particular. It's because to us, that state scale, to us is absolutely essential in understanding the story of development and also contestation and conflicts around development in the country. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Himachal, where bureaucracies, decentralized forms of governance, collective mobilizations, and also popular identities are internally relatively consistent, but externally extremely varied to even what is next door, that is Uttarakhand. The state scale, as I said, is hugely important in India in terms of development. Despite the same general conditions that are typically understood as forms of neoliberal economy and governance, outcomes are widely divergent between different states of the country. Himachal has been in the national development debate, as everyone here would know, as some sort of an exemplar, at least in the last 15 to 20 years. And there has been a marked progress in social infrastructure and indicators, like in terms of poverty reduction, access to healthcare, education, and employment. There is, however, a sort of a hypercritical academic perspective that you sometimes see in Delhi academia in particular, that dismisses these gains as simply crumbs that the government or the state throws to people, or as some sort of pressure valve to release contradictions of class in the society. But at least I find this approach to be extremely insensitive to both the lived experiences of people and also to collective mobilization and political actions that people have been taking at considerable risk to themselves. In contrast, therefore, our attempt here is to take these developments seriously, but to critically engage with their multiple implications. We wish to analyze, among other things, the various aspects of this progress, this unevenness within the state. There is no one story, even within Himachal, of how this larger process translates on the ground. Certainly its environmental and ecological costs, which have been discussed, and we have papers today on the panel about it. And the challenges, new challenges that have emerged in the wake of the arrival of industrial capital and real estate in the state. And we wish to do so, or to engage with these issues, not as a recent World Bank report, which I was going through last week, does in a strange sort of marriage of neoclassical economics and environmental determinism. So for them, people, the state is stable in Himachal because people live close by, the terrain is difficult. I mean, that sort of stuff you used to hear 100 years ago in geography. Still very much alive. But we want to do research that is deeply engaged, ethnographic, looks at specificities, but also never loses sight of scalar connections, of connections with the region, the national debate, even global markets and systems of governance. So this panel is part of this larger project. So there is a logic to why Himachal here today. And this afternoon we shall have presentations on, well, first from Dr. Hal Fischer, who's with the Indian School of Business, freshly minted PhD. So you can congratulate him after the panel. He's going to talk about or bring in some geographical insights into on aspects of rural change in Kangra district. Second, we have presentation by Prashant Negi, who is at Jamia Millia Islamia, on the shady economies that sort of attach to hydropower generation, which has been one of the cornerstones of the state's at least revenue generation. A third presentation is by Dr. Anu Sablok, who is at ICER Mohali, on the work and lives of migrants, whose, in a way, dead labor sort of offers mobility across tough terrains in the state. So we want to sort of look at who is making the state, right? It's not just people who live there, but so many migrants from different parts of the country and beyond, for instance, Nepal. And our final presentation of the day is by Dr. Sudha Vasan from the University of Delhi, which is a very interesting study on sort of longitudinal understanding of the effects of migration on village society and the relationships with natural resources. So there's a packed schedule. If I can just request you to keep an eye on Saurabh, who's our graduate student.
Some of you remember me. When I was doing my doctoral fieldwork in Himachal Pradesh in 2012, I was in AUD off and on, so I recognize quite a few people from then. So anyway, it's really great to see a lot of familiar faces. I am indeed at the Indian School of Business now. I don't know a thing about business. I'm actually a postdoctoral research fellow there working on a project on agriculture. I'm trained as a human geographer, so I must say it's really nice to be presenting to a school of human ecology because that's probably where I feel much more comfortable. The work that I'm going to present on today is actually from my doctoral field work, my doctoral research, not the work I'm working on right now. So I will share that with you. When I arrived in the Kangra district to conduct my doctoral fieldwork, I was surprised at the eloquent ways in which many people spoke of agriculture as being central to Kangri identity. People would say things like, agriculture is a part of our culture. It is a part of what we do. I cannot not do agriculture. It's very important to us. And alongside this, there was this almost constant lament about the decline of agriculture in contemporary Kangri society. Many people are abandoning agricultural production, people said. They're abandoning their cultural heritage. The younger generations have lost interest. They don't know the value of what they're losing. And I was struck by the similarities between this discourse and the kind of agrarian idealism that is so often seen in urban communities, wherein agricultural production is somehow a simpler and purer way of life. And something just didn't sit right with me about all of this. And what I slowly realized that the individuals who spoke so eloquently about the agrarian roots of Kangri society were, in fact, wealthy individuals, many of whom had secure non-farm employment, some of whom worked in banks, had government jobs, and so on. Some of them still practiced agriculture, and many were indeed passionate about it. But much of the traditional practice was, in fact, done by their wives. What I soon realized, too, was that the complaints about the loss of this agrarian culture was not just about the younger generations losing interest. It was about this as well, but it was also about the increasing difficulty to find affordable, obedient labor. And so the perceived erosion of this agrarian culture was, in fact, as much about dimensions of class and gender as about some abstract notions of Himachali society. So this presentation will seek to build on these observations to explore how changes in agricultural practice is linked to transformations in power and authority in contemporary Kangri society. So let me begin by situating this within my broader body of work. My doctoral dissertation looked at this fuzzy thing that we call local democracy. And of course, we know that participation, empowerment, all of these things are development buzzwords. Oftentimes, they're really not met in practice. But in my study, and the place where I lived, and I think is characteristic of the area where I was working more generally, I actually documented a pretty radical change that happened over the past 2 decades. So whereas political power had at one point been concentrated in the hands of just a few elites, it was actually, there were many people of many different social categories involved in public decision-making processes, including many people from marginal groups. And of course, this didn't just happen by itself, and there's many institutional reasons that it occurred. Things like the Panchayati Raj Act that happened over 2 decades ago, political reservations for women in low caste, and the gradual empowerment of these institutions. But there's important reasons why this has worked in the area where I was working, and I think in Himachal more generally, and it hasn't worked so well elsewhere. So what I want to suggest is that part of the reason that we have seen these successes is in fact rooted in this process of agrarian change that we're presently witnessing. So as a sort of rough sketch of what I'm talking about, what I want to suggest is that politics and power, the ability to leverage claims within these formal institutions such as panchayats is closely tied to identity and social status. Actually, that's something that has pretty well been documented. And identity and status is, of course, rooted in some level in a material basis of livelihoods and assets, okay? There is a long tradition of scholarship that has looked at how changing labor relations has, in fact, accompanied, in many cases, accompanied new forms of political expression. I don't have time to get into the various strands of this research. What I want to suggest is that what we're seeing in Himachal, in many cases, is a very advanced version of this. So let me be clear. I'm not trying to suggest that growth in the capitalist economy is somehow ushering in an era of market equality that supersedes other forms of social hierarchy. That's not what I'm trying to argue. I think that new economic opportunities in conjunction with all these other human development gains that have happened in Himachal over the past few decades is, in fact, reconstituting social relationships. So that's the central thesis that I'm working with. And this has provided space for marginal groups to rework their identity and to claim greater recognition in the public sphere. Of course, this is differentiated across the state, so I'll try to make my generalizations about a very specific area where I'm working. So all of this is by way of introduction. I'm going to focus in this presentation on this section here, livelihoods, assets, changing economies, and how that is linked to identity and status. I want to tell this story by looking at common pool irrigation governance. Kangra agriculture is sustained by a rich network of irrigation canals, which are known as pools. This is one such canal. And these canals channel glacial streams from rivers, channel water from glacial streams to agricultural fields for wet rice cultivation. This particular one is 17 kilometers long, so these are actually a very big deal, and they require this very elaborate system of collective action that has been in place apparently for the past several hundred years. And this collective action actually mobilizes labor on a periodic basis to do maintenance, to negotiate seasonal timings of water use, and to adjudicate water use rights. So I think common pool resource governance is interesting for the present discussion because it is often assumed that common systems grow out of a social context in which there's a high degree of social cohesion and solidarity. And in fact, this vision of communal harmony is one of the most ubiquitous tropes about Himachal Pradesh. So and we see this in popular culture, but in academic works as well. So for example, Dres and Sen suggests that one of the factors that has led to Himachal's relative success is that there's a high degree of cooperation as exemplified in collective resource management institutions. We have a work about the Cools of Kangra, which is really fantastic, written by an anthropologist named Mark Baker. But he, I think, sort of underplays the degrees in which power plays through these institutions. So in the case of Kangra, I just want to suggest that there is a high degree, and historically has been a high degree of equality in water access. However, if you look at where power lies, the Kohli, who is the water master, was almost always a high caste man. And the terms of legitimacy, I think, were historically disproportionately shaped by the interests of the landed groups. But more fundamentally, I want to suggest that cool governance is wrapped up in an economic system of very differentiated opportunities, assets, and status. Agriculture is instrumental in determining dimensions of power and authority within society. And so this is where what I wanted to show, oh, we're shaking. What I want to show is how this is changing over the past several decades. Okay. So I based this work on several villages where I conducted my doctoral field work in 2012. My study area comprised 4 main primary cools. You can kind of see here, they're the white ones that are spreading across the agricultural terrain. They come from the glacial streams here, which are in blue, and the yellow are the panchayats where I was working. Not an important point, I just wanted to give you a look at what it looks like. Okay. So I'm just going to park it here. I don't tend to put a lot of text on my slides because I'd rather just tell it to you. So anyway. Okay, so the Cools in this area were managed by a single family for as long as anyone can remember. In the mid-1970s, a man named Kesri assumed the position of Koli, that is the water master, which he held until his death in the early 2000s. He had received training from his father from a young age, and he had intimate knowledge about every curve and bend of the Cools. And several times a year, he would go around the village banging a drum, as was the custom, and every household was required to send a male to work on the Cools to maintain them and prepare them for the cropping season. And this would be a long, drawn-out thing over the period of a week. So what I want to focus on, however, is this other character that entered the picture, a man who I shall call Ashok Kumar, who is a low-caste man of the Lohar community. It is not uncommon for a low-caste individual to be an assistant to the Koli. This happens with some regularity. But I bring up Ashok Kumar because I think he reflects a lot of the changes that happened in Kangra in the 20th century. Ashok Kumar was, he grew up very poor. His family had some land, but materially they didn't have a lot of assets. And he was of the first generation of people in the village to actually get universal primary education. And it was, in fact, in primary school that he originally met Kesri, the actual Koli. He was trained as a tailor and practiced this for a number of years, and with a stroke of luck, he achieved a position working in a government office. He was a chowkidar. It wasn't a very nice position, generally speaking, but his salaried income and generous pensions actually put him in the top earning bracket of the village. So with this, he gained a certain amount of status. And eventually, he actually got into helping to manage the Cools with Kesri. And I don't have a good account about why this happened, but it just sort of gradually happened. And through his involvement in the Cools and his income, he actually gained quite a bit of status in the community for a man that was of a low caste. So I think it's safe to say that the life opportunities of Ashok would have been very different than his father's before him. But his experience only hints at a broader transformation that has occurred in Kangri society during this time. So while Kulu and other parts of Himachal Pradesh have diversified into cash crops, this hasn't exactly happened in Kangra for a variety of reasons. Some are biophysical, and I think also the very big investments in education have given a relatively capable workforce that has been able to achieve a number of other jobs. So whereas people at one point worked mostly in their village, actually this isn't the case anymore. So I would say a majority of the people, the males where I was working actually migrated to nearby towns to do their work. Not migrated, they just went during the day and they came back at night. So towns like Palampur and Bajnath. A second thing is long-distance migration has increased greatly. So there's a huge population of men from the village working in Chandigarh or Delhi, doing a variety of things. And they're not the type of people that are doing these menial construction jobs. They're actually the type of people that get taxis, they're driving taxis or they're working in an office or something. So finally, there has always been a very large army presence in Kangra. It continues to be so, but there's also, I think because of the very educated population, a relatively high proportion of people working in government employment. So the first thing I want to point out here about all of this is that a huge proportion of the population doesn't actually work in the village anymore. So this takes them out of the village hierarchy, at least for employment. And this had several effects on social relationships. So the first thing is that local employers can't find labor. Contractors in the village regularly complain that formerly people would show up early at the job site, they would beg them for labor, they would work really, really hard. This doesn't happen anymore, and a lot of times they can't even find enough labor to do the task. So of course this is supply and demand at work. But the important point that I want to say here is that this has eroded to some extent the economic base of these elites, but it has also sort of challenged their symbolic authority. So they don't inspire the same amount of obedience that they once did. And this has, of course, produced greater economic autonomy for the laboring classes, which are no longer bound by these relationships. So at the same time, this has, I should say, let's see, I should probably, so what I want to suggest is that the growing economic opportunities and the growing availability of cash income has also it's changed what status looks like in the community, basically. So having status is no longer about having a lot of land or having a huge herd of goats, right? It's increasingly about whether you have the pucka house next to the road with a car attached to it. And believe me, there's actually quite a few people in the village that fit that description, so that's not uncommon anymore. More fundamentally, I think there's symbolic aspects of what that means to be able to consume that. So again, I'll turn to Ashok Kumar, and like I said, he was trained as a tailor, so he often talked about growth and poverty in relation to clothes. And one thing he said to me once was, in the 1970s, everyone became a gentleman. And what he meant by that is that it was at this historical juncture that there was enough disposable income that everyone could afford to look nice. They could afford nice clothes if they wanted to, right? And for me, I mean, I don't want to overstate this sort of equality thing. It's not an equal society, but what this statement really said to me about, I think is very significant about what this says of how he perceives the ordering of society as fundamentally changing. Before, some people could be gentlemen. Now everyone could, in theory, be one because there was enough disposable income. So let me touch on a few more points. So speaking of gentlemen, we can talk about women now. So what does this mean for agriculture? So first of all, while men are working outside of the village mostly, that means that the presence of women in agriculture has increased very significantly over the past several decades. This too is now changing. There's a greater presence of women in labor positions, off-farm employment. I mean, there's a lot of reasons for this. I think changing values and position of women in society that's happened in conjunction with all of these changes. Another big push has been Narega, actually. So Narega enabled a lot of women to go take labor that was close to the home, so they could go do that. And for some of them, this actually pushed them into other forms of employment. So I know one woman who said something to me like the effect of, when I started working under Narega, I realized that I could do construction too. Right? So she realized that she could haul stones and do these other sorts of small-scale development projects and construction tasks around the village. So that's the work that she prefers to do if she can find it. If she has to do agriculture, she'll do it, but she doesn't really want to. And I think there's a sense of value in women's labor, where it's being valued in terms of monetary benefits in a way that it never was in the past. So when women talk about agriculture as being this very hard, laborious job for low pay, a lot of them just don't want to do it anymore. Okay, great, excellent. So this all has had an effect on land, on the value of land. So I accompanied one man to the fields one year because I wanted to know what it was like to plant rice. He didn't have a lot of land, but it was clear that he didn't really want to invest time in this. Subsidies for food grains are cheap. His son has a very good position in the Navy. He has some income from the shop. He doesn't really want to invest time in this. So we labored for a couple of days. We got it all done. He hired someone to help us as well. And at the end of 2 days, we were sort of sitting at his house, and our whole bodies hurt because that's just what happens. And I enjoyed my time doing it and everything. But at a certain point, he just turned to me. He said, "This is terrible work. It's just terrible. I don't want to do this anymore. From next year on, I'm not planting rice." I don't know. I'll visit back there and figure out what actually happened that year. But this is a sentiment that I hear more and more, right? So this idea of agriculture as being an important part of heritage, it's one thing to say, but when you're out there in the fields, this is a very different feeling. And there remains a very strong stigma against not cultivating in your land. So this means that a lot of people feel that they have to do it. What has emerged from this is a very interesting market where there's actually a number of landlords that have a lot of lands that are going around the village trying to find people that will cultivate their land for free. Just like, get it off my hands, right? I've never heard of that elsewhere, but what's really interesting is that there's very small group of people that are looking and shopping around from these landlords to find the free land to cultivate. I find this very interesting because land used to be an aspect of status. Now it's sort of a liability in a lot of respects. What's more is that the people that get to cultivate this land get to do it for free, and they get to do it in a way that's to a large degree stripped of the symbolic aspects of power that are embedded in this landlord-labor relationship. Okay, so a little bit more time. About the cools. What was the next one? Okay. Women laborers. Actually, this is a woman working under Narega on a cool. I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so this Koli Kestri died in the early 2000s. And his son, who had gained, by that time, a very good job in Chandigarh, I don't know what he does, but he didn't come home to take on the role of Koli. And no one blamed him for it. They understood, right? So in the last years of Ashok Kumar's life, he really had assumed this role of being the Koli. The community wouldn't recognize him as such because he didn't have the lineage, but he had that status and that recognition. He also passed on. His son has since made half-hearted attempts to take on that role. He lacks the commitment, I think, but he also lacks the social authority of his father. So his father had claimed this legitimacy as the water master in a very different era, when that still existed. And it really doesn't exist anymore. So people still talk about the traditional system, but when it comes down to it, the collective maintenance isn't really happening, at least as part of a large communal effort. People still do maintenance near to their fields and other places when necessary, but there's no real concerted effort, and there's no central authority in charge. So this is what happens when you don't maintain your cool. It grows, and the water doesn't flow well, and sometimes the walls break, and so on. Okay, so I'll just try to finish up a few things. And so I don't have to get time to get into the details of this, but actually the cools are not dying, even though there is less and less maintenance. And in fact, there's a variety of new forms of governance emerging, new forms of civil society engagement, involvement of a variety of government programs, and sometimes even the panchayat, which is at times doing work under Narega itself. Here's an example. I won't spend time to talk about these. So this is earthen maintenance that they did. It actually looks really nice compared to what it looked like before. So I don't have time to get into this larger argument or where this larger argument is going. But what I want to suggest as part of the larger project is that one of this, the character of water governance in this area is becoming less and less about community per se and these forms of hierarchical solidarity that once existed. It's far more about citizens' ability to leverage influence on state institutions and about, in short, democratic citizenship. And that takes us, in a sense, full circle. The difference is that the community has more or less been recreated in a way that no longer supports some of the most severe forms of social inequality that it did in the past. Economic changes have recreated, recentered the economy, and challenged forms of social hierarchy that were rooted in labor relations and other existing forms of social status. And certainly inequalities remain. And if you looked at the aggregate, economic inequalities may well have increased. But if you look at the social landscape, it's far more open than it ever was in the past. So if agriculture and common systems are sort of these iconic examples of the supposed harmony of Himachali society, I have actually argued that it's through the erosion of these that has afforded greater social equality. And while this has challenged aspects of agrarian culture that many Himachalis hold dear, it is actually, for me, hard to truly lament this loss, to the extent that it is accompanied with greater economic self-sufficiency, social autonomy, and empowerment of the poor.